Welcome to the Western Voice and this first show for 2021. I've dipped into some deep issues by having Shuvaloy Majumdar on as a guest. Shuvaloy I've known him for some time. He's a Munk Senior Fellow, specializing in foreign policy and a program leader with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It's quite a mouthful. The bottom line is he's a pretty bright guy with a lot of world experience who's been studying and speaking to international affairs. And he has recently taken on the big elephant in the room that a lot of our government officials seem terrified to deal with, which is China. The bad practices from China, how deeply integrated China is with our economy, and how we should be dealing with China going forward. So he wrote a piece in iPolitics called "If Australia Can Shun China, Canada Should Too." Because this isn't uncharted territory. China's aggressive economic practices and such are being done all over the world. And Australia was far more dependent on China and tight to them in proximity and in trade than we are. And they're successfully distancing themselves from that relationship. And Shuvaloy explains how and why Canada should follow suit with Australia and do the same thing. Well, thank you so much for coming on with me, Shuv. It's good to see you again, if only virtually. It's
Good to see
been
you too,
a
Corey.
while, yeah. And so, I mean, you caught my interest recently. It is an issue. I think that it's such a monstrous one. It has been in the news, but it's still been overwhelmed by just so much other stuff in the news. And that's China. I mean, they are a large and growing nation that's integrated with every element of our economy, our politics, and our immigration, just all around. But we're really discovering what a terrible partner and friend they are on so many levels. So you and Brett Byers wrote a piece in iPolitics. It was entitled "If Australia Can Shun China, Canada Should Too." And it was a really good piece, and laying out another example of somebody who managed to survive standing up to China, I guess you could say. So maybe to begin with, though, what are the reasons then that we should be, like, why should we distance ourselves from China? What's China been doing wrong? What have they been doing badly? I know it's a long list.
It's a huge list, probably as long as my leg, but permit me to try and offer just a few key things here. First and foremost, China has proven that they have asserted themselves as a strategic rival to the West. This is a country, a Communist Party-led country, that is not interested in developing fruitful economic partnerships as they had made the case for over the last decades. Instead, they're trying to build a model of governance for the West and around the world that sees Beijing at the very top and the world's political, military, and economic arteries leading to a rising and reinvigorated Middle Kingdom. They're looking to replace the international order of the post-war, the post-Second World War era, in which they themselves have benefited so much from. Primarily because I think they seize that this is a moment for them to seize the advantage. They see the West in disarray. They see emerging economies around the world as ripe for the picking. And so Beijing seems to be really focused on trying to establish its own assertiveness in the age to come. In Canada specifically, they've been bullying us. They've been using their wolf warrior diplomacy with a megaphone against Canadian institutions, Canadian parliamentarians. They've had their agents operating across the country to intimidate Chinese Canadians. They have taken 2 hostages as a notorious means of hostage diplomacy, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, ostensibly to see some sort of quid pro quo deal for their own telecom executive, Meng Wanzhou, to be released from custody in Vancouver. They've proven over the last year that they are not interested in a partnership with Canada, but rather they're interested in putting Canada under the thumb. And I think it's time that we stood up to that.
Yeah, so as you laid out, I mean, Australia, well, China's been doing this with everybody. I mean, they are
Yes.
an aggressive, large entity, and as you said, China's there to serve China. Their interests are nothing more than serving the central government in the country. I guess you could somewhat respect that, but then you should deal with them on that basis and in knowing that. So Australia was much more tightly intertwined with China and dependent on them actually for their exports on a number of things, but they did stand up and push back at China
Right.
with their actions. So what exactly did Australia do, and how's that been working out?
Listen, Corey, in the Western world, Australia has been the most collaborative with China over the last 15, 20 years. I mean, here they are in a dangerous neighborhood. You think about the geography of Australia, proximate to Southeast Asia, to China, to India, to Japan. They have had to be very realistic about what their interests are in their own near neighborhood. And even from Tiananmen and onward, they've always been very muted about Chinese leadership, about the decisions and divergences from values that the Chinese Communist Party has had with the West because of pure pragmatism. So for Australia to take note in the last years that this engagement that they've had with China, which has been principally economic, is no longer worth it. That Chinese investment in Australia is no longer worth it. That Chinese tentacles reaching into the Australian political class is no longer worth it. That the Chinese strategic and security threat to the waters of the Indo-Pacific are no longer worth it, is this very significant lesson for Canadians and Canadian policymakers to take. Australia represents in so many ways the kinds of interests that Canada does. And for the most pragmatic Western nation to say, no, we're going to decouple from China because it's not worth maintaining this relationship for us. In fact, China has become such a belligerent power in our own economy inside Australia, is something that we should be able to take a cue from. I mean, the Australian economy is heavily leveraged by Chinese investment and Chinese trade partnerships with major Australian exports going into China. And for them to say, we're done, we're out, we're going to remake a different order that we wanted to have with you, is something that Canadians should should pay attention to. What Brett and I wrote about was to say that Canada is not nearly as leveraged in China as Australia is. Our trade volumes, although we think that they are quite high, and Chinese Canadian trade is second after the United States by a huge margin. Our exports to China are actually quite minuscule compared to Australia's. That's not to say that the farmers, the agricultural sector, the groups of Canadians that are trading with China have insignificant interests. They are very significant interests, but there are other opportunities for those markets. And as a country, we need to think about how we want to have a backbone alongside our allies in confronting this risk that Beijing now promotes.
Yeah, well, and it's been interesting to watch. I saw a recent story actually that China is feeling the pushback from Australia. They banned Australian coal and figured it was going to hurt Australia, but now what they've got are blackouts in
Right.
South China due to
Right.
the lack of coal. They can't get it in, so their
Right.
bluff has been called. And I mean, if anything's going to perhaps change some of their behavior, it's when it hurts themselves. As we've sort of established, China's there
Yeah.
for China. Well, this is harming China. I mean, it just, again, we've had two Canadians held hostage by these guys for over 2 years now. I mean, we hear about it periodically, but we really should be more, outspoken. If it had been any other nation, I mean, we would have been rallying the troops almost.
Right.
In this case, I mean, so why is our federal government so reticent when it comes to dealing with China as opposed to a lot of other nations with a lot of their human rights violations to, well, other people, their own people, and neighboring nations, including ourselves?
It's interesting you say that question, Corey. And I also think it's really important what you just said is that China is indeed constrained by its own interests. If they cut off coal, which powers much of the Chinese economy, they will experience blackouts, brownouts. They need Canadian energy. They need food security like anybody else. Their reliance on unstable regimes around the world and their partnerships with countries like Iran or Pakistan are not proving to be very fruitful for them. In fact, they're losing capital, they're losing money on that. And so at some point, the Communist Party has to overcome its own ideology to confront the realities of what China's economic growth demands. And that is long-term stable partnerships with countries like Australia, Japan, the United States, Canada, and others. Now, why does Ottawa not get this? That's a great question. My colleagues at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and I spent a lot of time reflecting on this. What happens, what appears to be happening is that in Ottawa, there is amongst much of the academy, much of the media commentariat, much of the bureaucracy, a prevailing ideology of yesteryear in which China was seen as an economic partner. And much of Canadian foreign policy was focused purely on the economic potential of Canada-China relations at the expense of Southeast Asia, East Asia, India, Japan, and others. We have heard over the last year that Ottawa is trying to formulate its own policy in this Indo-Pacific region. We have seen nothing of concrete material substance that says that they've made any progress on that. And we've also heard separately that they're looking at what their position should be on China. I think the reason we haven't had a backbone when it came to China's effective betrayal of Hong Kong or Chinese treatment of Uyghurs in Northeast Xinjiang province or other minorities is because we don't have a policy yet. I think it's a non-decision that Justin Trudeau, Francois Philippe Champagne, and the Liberal cabinet have had when it comes to China. I don't think that they've made a decision yet that China is actually acting against the interests of Canadians, that they are actually trying to hurt our country and leverage their relationships in Canada to try and have some sort of say over what Ottawa decides. I think that's the number one problem, is that Ottawa is yet to make a decision about China. Secondly, I think Ottawa is frozen in an old view of the Indo-Pacific region and the potential partnerships we should be enjoying. Countries like India and Japan, Australia, and others are working to create new alliances, economic, military, security, and we should be an active part of those alliances. And third, in the developing countries of Southeast Asia, in which the center of gravity for all global growth over the next 20 to 30 years will come, there is an opportunity there as they decide whether they want to turn to the West or turn to Beijing for how is the best way to develop their countries. I think the West has a better proposition, but we need to get our act together. And in order to do that, capitals like Ottawa need to understand that this is a new region rising and we have a role to play in it as a Pacific power. And these are the realities of these times.
Yeah, well, and we're in a turning point in world history, essentially. And I'd spoken to David Clement recently on CANZOC and other concepts that are coming for broadening trade and perhaps with more appropriate partnerships. But I mean, it's much easier said than done too. So I mean, us and pretty much everybody in the developed world has become pretty addicted to the very cheap consumer products that we get. I mean, it's hard to buy anything these days without looking and finding a label and saying that it was made in China. Plus, we're coming into a period where a lot of people don't have a lot of excess income. They're trying to keep their cost of living down. If we made a sudden change away from China, it will have an impact on our consumers within Canada, let alone our exporters, in the agricultural and some of the raw resources. So how could one do such things, or how did Australia do that without having price shocks? Or, can you ease into sanctions, or what sort of means does the government have at its disposal?
What's interesting about Australia, and I think it's kind of not well understood, is that for Australians, they've been experiencing growth, massive growth over the last decade or so. Even after the huge economic recession of 2008 and 2009, Australians never been in a period of negative growth. Like they've never experienced debt. They've been doing a very good job economically. And so this is the first time in which they're experiencing an economic contraction, which some would suggest the Australians can afford because they're still posting growth through this COVID age. And I think that's kind of remarkable. Meanwhile, in the West, in Canada and elsewhere, we've had to contend with eye-watering levels of debt. We've had to understand what it means to try and balance a budget, even if we fail. But we understand what the costs of that are, in our wallets and at the grocery stores and when we're shopping. Now, when we're looking at what we can do in terms of dealing with the post-COVID environment, the economic recovery, and the huge question of China, my thought is that we really need to think about Canada as an economic power that has more to offer the world beyond the United States. It should be a growth agenda that we pursue, connecting our best industries and our manufacturing capacities, high-tech manufacturing. There's a lot of things that Canadians can produce and do, but we should be more confident about how we engage emerging economies where we've been a bit reluctant to do so because, frankly, we've benefited from a long undefended border and a prosperous American economy to tie our prosperity to. I'm not saying we should diminish that. I say we should be expanding that. into places that we have yet to pioneer. And that'll take a significant national project to do so, and a kind of confidence that our commercial sector has yet to really exhibit when it comes to markets beyond. On supply chains, on what you just mentioned with respect to cheap products, we as a country have the capacity to produce amazing things. What we need to do is partner with other countries that we can trust, that don't use trade relationships in a weaponized way against us, but do meaningful partnerships on the basis of the rule of law. And we should be encouraging new partnerships that are untouched, like in Japan or India or elsewhere, where there are huge commercial potential. I think some of these areas are places where we can think about building the supply chain partnerships, whether it's in pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, manufacturing, mining, resource, like all of those things across the gamut of the Canadian economy. These are places where we can be bold. And I think the time has certainly come for us to start imagining ourselves as that Pacific power.
Yeah, so I mean, and we've seen that acutely in Alberta, that there's few things to be worse in a worse position than having a limited number of customers, because then you're at the mercy of them and you end up putting your product out at a discounted price. Again, don't want to knock our American customers, but if we could get our products to Tidewater, that differential is going to ease pretty quickly. And I guess that would give you more alternatives if you're going to be moving away from one supplier of things as well. You can purchase from others. Some of that, though, again, as I said earlier, we are already deeply integrated. There's a lot of contracts, a lot of deals. There's a lot of Chinese companies heavily invested into Canadian resource projects. We have Huawei, which has been terribly unprincipled, and that's how they've ended up with one of their executives in custody. Yet at the same time, they've been developing and building this whole 5G network. Could there be sanctions or legal liabilities coming back at us from investors and such if we interfered with these companies that are partnered with Canadian companies?
When we look at Chinese investment, we have a vehicle in Canada called the Investment Canada Act, as you know, that allows us to look at these state-owned investments into the Canadian economy, whether it's in telecom or in mining and extractives, and determine case by case, whether or not this is in our economic interests or if the national security interests are too high. For example, in the Arctic, in Nunavut, there was a recent mine that a Chinese state-owned company was looking to invest heavily in. On many levels, it's not a bad pool of capital to attract, to try and develop jobs in the Canadian North, to develop infrastructure that can connect the Canadian North to the future shipping routes that the North can have. But it's also just 100 kilometers away across the strait from a NORAD facility. And the Chinese investments on key extractives and minerals are taken as a network from opportunities around the world. And this Canadian piece fits a vital part of their national strategy for securing those materials. We made the right decision to ban that investment from succeeding, to prevent that investment from succeeding, because the risks to Canada, to our partnership with the United States, is too high. Equally for 5G and for Huawei. The access that this Chinese telecom company would have to Canadian data, whether it's of our companies, of our individuals, is a risk too high to take. And it's unfortunate that the Canadian government has still yet to make a decision about whether to ban Huawei's ask to join Canada's 5G network or not. For existing investments, you think about the Chinese investments into the Alberta oil and energy sector, and a few others, that they don't seem to be doing particularly well, not because of any negative attempts by the Canadian side to make it succeed, but more because of the general price of oil and extractives globally. I think case by case, it makes sense to measure whether or not these investments are in the interest of Canada, but we should also be creating an investment thesis for the world that is better than what we have now. You mentioned getting our energy projects to Tidewater. Our country is a federation of provinces, but sometimes I wonder if we are less of a coherent economic group than the European Union. It's so hard to get nation building projects like energy or extractives to successfully take our products to market. And as a country, we need to have this conversation about how do we fix this problem? Because when we create a better investment climate, then there will be capital from all around the world looking to try and unlock this potential to the benefit of Canadians. And thus far, we failed. We failed as a country to be able to act as a country, to identify national interests, to overcome regional or local grievances in ways that are compelling, and to really work towards the prosperity and growth of the country. This is probably one of the biggest issues that we as Canadians have to figure out.
Yeah, well, and we're coming into what's probably going to be a tumultuous year. Unfortunately, things as critically important yet to a lot of people's minds abstract, they don't dominate election discussion, which is really
They should.
unfortunate. It really
They
should.
should.
And
Right? Yeah.
as you said, I mean, we see, yeah, European nations, landlocked nations, but they seem to have an easier time getting across neighboring nations because they've made agreements than we do from province to province. I mean, part of our strength is these abundant natural resources and three coastlines from which we could export, but we're all too busy fighting with each other inside to keep anybody else from getting across our land to get something to port. Quite a frustration. And again, the more clients, the better. So with some of that, though, I mean, again, with crackdowns, perhaps, I mean, you can reject upcoming projects and proposals from China, such as that mine in Nunavut, but the ones where they're already integrated, are there ways to ease them out? Or is it just maybe we'll accept those, but not any further ones?
To date, I think, these investments are, until they become, unless the math has changed for any one of them to become a national security risk, then there's no real reason to renege on those deals, so to say. And from my vantage point, none of those have really deteriorated to the point where there is a significant cost to Canadian national security, which is my number one focus, right? Like for me, I'm pretty pragmatic about investment. I think that we should be business friendly. We should be business friendly to the world, and for countries and actors and companies that want to do business responsibly and not abuse our rule of law to only try and recolonize Canada in their own way. We should be enthusiastic about those partnerships. But for future investment from China, I think we should be very, very skeptical. We should be a lot more knowledgeable about exactly, know your customer, know exactly what part of the Chinese government that particular commercial interest represents and how that supports China, or could be worse, to the detriment of Canada. We should be working with allied countries in North America, but well beyond, in Europe and around the world, in creating a system of trust, of a gated trading system that allows countries that respect the rule of law and democracy and capitalism to succeed and thrive, and countries that are frankly trying to tear it down, like the People's Republic of China, should not be permitted access to those markets until they prove that they're ready to participate in a rules-based international system that allows us all to prosper. And it should be as clear as that. Now, the work of accomplishing that is a lot harder than it is to prescribe the solution. That requires Western governments to cooperate on a level that they have not yet succeeded at, and to come to an understanding of what Beijing really represents to the world order. And that has yet to happen.
Yeah, well, and the government seemed to, I mean, it was astounding to find out, though, that the government, for example, when you're talking about national security, I mean, that should be the paramount interest, especially if you're going to interfere in free commerce or trade. Yet they invited Chinese troops to train in Canada. I can't imagine a more, way to expose yourself and make yourself vulnerable. It was only due to it blowing up in their face that they backed off. But boy, what a tone deaf and again, it discomforting. I mean, if they aren't seeing the threat, then how will they come to address it? Hopefully they learned a lesson from it. As you said, I mean, if other countries in Canada can follow Australia's suit, it could be better for China in the long run, for those of us who are interested in seeing development of human rights and better practices, because we say, well, come back to the table when you start playing a little better on your own shores. It gives us a different kind of leverage with them too.
Well, and Corey, this is something that Beijing and its wolf warrior diplomacy tries to say. It says people like me and others who are critics of the Communist Party and its governance are somehow anti-Chinese. One of the great opportunities that the world can benefit from is from the Chinese people, who deserve a rules-based system, who are entrepreneurial and productive and incredibly fun and engaging, commercially, culturally, in a whole host of different ways. I just get really frustrated when Beijing seems to think that they have some sort of control over Chinese culture, and that the Chinese people themselves are benefiting from the Communist Party's policies, when frankly, the Communist Party is the biggest barrier to the prosperity of the Chinese people, let alone the rest of us.
Yeah, well, and communist parties always are, but it's good to see. I guess communication and trade and things are bringing that to an end. People are realizing. I mean, wow, there's a better world out there, and hopefully some change comes from within. So, thank you very much for coming on. Where could we
Thank you.
find more information about the work you've been doing and stuff you've been releasing on these kinds of international issues?
Well, thanks for paying attention. Beyond my mother, I think that makes you the second person to read anything I've really written recently. So I
There's
appreciate it.
dozens.
The Macdonald-Laurier Institute is obviously, we're on Twitter at ML Institute. We're on the internet at macdonald-laurier.ca. We're an independent think tank based out of Ottawa. My colleagues that range across the spectrum of disciplines include people like David Mulroney, who was a former Canadian ambassador to China, Dick Fadden, who used to be the former National Security Advisor of Canada, Charles Burton, a former diplomat, prolific writer, author, commentator. We have incredible scholars and practitioners who have come together to argue what the Canadian interests are in this disrupted world. I'm so very proud of the work that we do together. So I'd love to encourage your audience to go to our website, get our updates, follow us on Twitter, participate in the debate, and insist to their politicians. This is the most important thing, Corey. Insist to their politicians that they actually advance the interest of Canada rather than some blind ideology of some, multilateralist view of the world. We should be making it very clear to our politicians that they should be representing the interests of Canadians, Canadian taxpayers, in everything that they do.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Hopefully 2021 is a productive year and moving towards those fronts. And as you said, I mean, the only way we're going to change the politicians is if the people voting for them ask them to change. So you guys are giving them the information to go with, and let's hope for a better year. So I'm sure
Congratulations on your program. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Shu. So always a great chat with Shuvaloy. And such great subject matter. That final point is really important. We're probably going into an election year. As we talked about, this is a huge issue that really does actually impact us all, but we don't hear a lot about it. When it comes to elections, we get hung up on some of the scandals and other things and forget some of the deeper policy areas. So keep that in mind, whether your elected representatives might be liberal or conservative or whatnot, but put them to the question on this China issue. Ask them, talk to them, tell them you want them to deal with this. We can't keep kicking this can down the road with this nation that's threatening our national security. So thanks for tuning in. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to hit subscribe down at the bottom so you can be up to date on these episodes as they come out every week. Get more stories in depth at the Post Millennial there online. Some great news, great opinions, great shows. And I'm on Twitter if you really want to tell me what you think at Corey B. Morgan. It's one of my favorite places to interact and get the love or hate from folks who've tuned in or read some of my utterances.